We also have another speaker who's interested in very similar topic to my work as well here in Zambia. So bats in agricultural landscapes. We've got Alex Howard, who is also back up for this hosting as well, just in case I go down. But obviously during this session, it might be a bit difficult. So we do also have others in the background in case. So she's going to be speaking about the perceptions and pest control of bats in apple orchards in central South Africa. She's studying with the University of the Free State. Take it away, Alex.
Please excuse me not using the camera as I've just come from the field, but today I'll be sharing some very preliminary results from my PhD looking at ecosystem services of bats in central South Africa in the Free State. With Prof. Peter Taylor at University of Free State, Prof. Aramonijam, and Prof. Wandamakota at University of Eswatini and Pretoria, respectively. So, my PhD wants to look at the potential of using bats in integrated pest management control strategies. And this is an infographic I recently found from a great review from last year of all the different sectors of bat research, conservation, education that we need to look at. Many of us will be aware of the important ecological role and economic benefits of bats, but I'll just be focusing on the arthropod suppression and potential pest control services that bats provide in the area. Some of the other aspects of my project also touch on these other sectors that I'll speak about later. Here's a photo of the waste bin at a local apple pack house. So in South Africa, over 255,000 tons of fresh apples are wasted every year, which is about $500 million that we export. So what if we could use bats to reduce the amount of insect damage on these apples? I'm sure many of you are familiar with the term agroecosystems. As we know, there's a growing demand for sustainable agriculture, and agriculture is a massive threat to habitat destruction, fragmentation, and loss of roosts for bats. So bats are known to consume economically important crop pests in many different agroecosystems around the world. And this figure for their pest control services range from over $3 billion to $50 billion a year. However, not a lot is known between deciduous fruits such as apples and bats in South Africa. And there's an increased pressure to reduce the amount of pesticides and chemical control we use on our agriculture, yet people don't want any insect damage on their apples. PhD is divided into three main sections. For the last 2 years, I've been doing acoustic monitoring of bats on all the apple farms. But before I started, during and after, we've been interviewing the farmers, growers, and the relevant stakeholders, and basically co-designed the project with them. But these interviews really helped a lot to identify roosts on all the farms, as well as all the farmers were very happy to install bat boxes on the study sites. And these roosts and bat boxes were really instrumental to get fecal samples. And this guano will now be used for molecular analysis this year to find out what the bats are eating. Of course, I'm also trying to take the chemical control regimes that they use on the farms into consideration and whether pesticides are affecting the bats. And finally, all of this will be used to calculate economic estimates of what is the pest control services that these bats are providing in this area. For those of you who are not familiar, I work in the center of South Africa around Lesotho, and these are the 6 apple farms between Warden and Harrismith. There are 3 by the same landowner, and then some closer to the mountains. The Lasdorf in blue outside Clarence is closest to the Drakensberg, which I'll highlight again later. I use the SM4 wildlife acoustic sound meters at 3 fixed sites at each farm. In the middle of the orchard, one is placed at the edge of the orchard and at the nearest water source. You can see an example there. And they record for a minimum of 3 nights, and then I rotate the detectors to the next farm. Preliminary seasonal results from spring, summer, and winter last year. We recorded over 60,000 bat passes. At least 9 insectivorous bat species. Some need to be confirmed with molecular and more release calls, but please note the recording nights per farm haven't been corrected for. I won't be presenting the microhabitat, well, the locality, but as expected, the water sources had much higher diversity and bat activity than the edge and the middle of the orchards. However, there was still bat activity throughout the orchards, which was a nice relief. And these are just some of photos of the bat species that we detected. Again, no statistics yet, but what was a surprise is that spring across all the sites except Lastor Farm had higher mean bat diversity than summer, which wasn't expected. Lastor, as I said, closest to the mountains, had more bat diversity in summer. The other surprise was there are at least 2 bat species that stay throughout winter, even though we hardly see any of the bats, which was also quite interesting, being Laphotis capensis and Tadarida aegyptiaca don't seem to move out of the area. Because the bats are flying in and around the orchards doesn't mean they're eating anything or helping. So I looked at feeding buzzers. As most of us will know, when a bat hones in, such as the slit-face bat, Nectaris tabaca on the macadamia stink bug, the spectrogram changes quite obviously in duration and amplitude as the bat screams louder and faster to zone in. So I manually labeled all of these, but I am switching to machine learning. So this was an underestimate, conservative approach. And to my foraging activity, feeding buzzers on all the study sites, but in a much lower proportion to the total activity. However, this makes sense as obviously bats are echolocating to navigate, commute, socialize, and the feeding buzzers are a subset of these total calls. But again, there's quite a large discrepancy between the amounts of foraging activity between the farms. A bat box project, which not only tries to measure occupancy and if there's experimental differences between black and white, but was also a citizen science awareness initiative. So installed 12 boxes in 6 pairs in August 2021 on all the farm study sites. And first occupancy ranged from 8 weeks to over 8 months. Last year, February, about half were being used, but by April and July, most of the boxes either had bats or guano present. So the trays below are, we call them poop scoops, and that's a good indicator if bats are using the box, but might not be present when you check, but also a great way to get guano samples. We've also installed boxes at the schools, where interestingly enough, only the black boxes seem to be used, and quite a few residents in Clarence, the nearby town, have also bought and installed boxes. However, occupancy has been much lower. This is just a very rough table to compare black and white boxes, which are installed back to back. And most of the time, the Cape Ceratines, Laphotis capensis, prefer to use the black boxes, which makes sense as this is quite a temperate, cold area. However, in January, now 2 weeks ago when I checked, a lot more bats were using the white boxes, and we have finally much higher occupancy as all the boxes were being used for the first time. The quick part of the PhD is we've been using the bat survey to assess attitude towards bats based on Perez et al. 2021 Bats Attitude Standard Scale. And this 5-point Likert scale is also divided into different categories throughout the questionnaire. But what you need to take note of is 1 is strongly disagree and 5 strongly agree on the different categories. Be interviewing the farmers, residents, and pensioners of the nearby town before any bat boxes or talks were done. Most of the attitudes are quite similar. Most of them have quite low attitudes when it comes to being emotionally or emotionally or behaviorally interested in bats, and low myths. And only the residents had very positive attitudes regarding bats in terms of their place in the ecosystem. So this will be interesting to see how it changes over time. And then I'm going to keep investigating the potential for bats as integrated pest management strategies, but I think I want to highlight the importance of approaching the stakeholders first, including them in all aspects of projects and co-designing, and also using integrative research, not just looking at biological or conservation science, but also any relevant economic and social aspects to your work, as well as hybrid methods for acoustics. But yes, ultimately I'm hoping to quantify the cost of losing these bats from this agro-ecosystem and what are the pest control services that they are providing. And finally, thank you to Bats Without Borders for organizing the events and the support from Wildlife Acoustics and Rufford Foundation, as well as all the provincial and national authorities for my permits, and the really great landowners and stakeholders that I work with who have supported the project. Don't hesitate to contact me if you have any questions. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Alex. There don't seem to be any questions in the chat at the moment. We are running a little bit behind time, but maybe I could ask a very brief question. You mentioned about collecting droppings from your bat boxes. Have you done any analysis on the droppings and maybe looking at pests that are in the droppings? Or is that something that you'd like to do?
Yeah, so actually Dr. Merker's in here. She's presenting next, I think, and we've been chatting. So hopefully in the next couple of months, that's what I'll be doing. But luckily the boxes and all the active sampling, we got a lot of guano now. We now just need to figure out what they're eating and when and where. But that's all the lab work planned for this year.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much again. If anybody has any further questions for Alex, please do put them in the chat, and I'm sure she would be happy to answer them, or obviously email her as well.